Thank you all for having me back up in northern Alabama. I was calling that nice gentleman who drove. I'm sorry, your first name again is? Donnie. Donnie was nice enough to drive me up here, and quite frankly, I forgot how beautiful it was up here. The only thing I have a challenge with northern Alabama is it's 2 hours farther away from the beach than my wife is happy with. So she grew up in Nags Head, North Carolina. Actually, I'm going to talk about that in a second as it relates to this particular topic. By the way, thank you for the coffee. This is perfect. So tonight, a presentation we're going to discuss for the next couple of minutes. Oh no, thank you. I found something. Thank you.
Free coffee to anybody that wants it.
And homemade Vietnamese saffron.
Really good. Very kind of you. I'm going to talk about the Confederate ambulance corps. Anybody here served with the forces, the Army, Navy, Marines? So we know the value of our combat medics and our doctors and nurses and the military. It all started here, at least in the United States. France actually was the one that got the lead on ambulances and putting doctors in the battlefield. Prior to that, if you got wounded in battle, you were pretty much just out of luck. If you were a member of the nobility, so to speak, or the landed gentry, maybe your batman, your footman, your manservant, whoever might have been the one who might have taken care of you. Maybe you could afford a local doctor. The common soldier, not so much. You were actually better off in the naval services. They actually had ship surgeons. And contrary to popular beliefs, that ship surgeons weren't all alcoholics who were the ones who couldn't make it back in London. They were actually pretty good at what they did. You've seen the classic Mutiny on the Bounty, Charles Blount, great film. A lot better than the two remakes they did in the 60s and the aughts. So, how do we get to medical care during the American Civil War? Well, it starts off like this. Anywhere between 500 plus 1,000 casualties. Of course, as you well know, this particular war is in fact the bloodiest war ever fought in the United States. Hands down. Friends and foes cared as best they could. I talk about Sergeant Kirkland up there. If you've never been to Mary's Heights, the Battle of Fredericksburg, that's a very poignant moment. We'll talk about that towards the end. Serious wounds, chances are you're going to die where you are. What we would call ambulatory, the walking wounded, you might be able to get off the battlefield. And you might be able to get to somewhere where there were casualty collection stations. If you were lucky, maybe you even got to a hospital. Field hospitals did exist, or will exist. We talk about the saw and the knife being the primary way of dealing with it. This is only partially true. Amputations, cauterizing wounds had actually fallen out of favor at this point. We kind of figured out that causing third-degree burns to a wound probably wasn't helping. The amputations were more as a result of the technology at the time. Heavier firepower coming out of rifles, a 57. Any of you ability muzzleloading or reenacting, you know how large a lead ball moving at a low velocity won't kill you, but it's going to do a lot of damage. Oh, by the way, and with all due respect to my reenactors out here who may be in the crowd, gentlemen, don't wash the uniforms, please. Just let them set for about 6 weeks after you've worn them. And then go crawl around in the mud and then wear them again. And then you get some idea of the sanitary conditions that exist at the time. Oh, by the way, that 57 caliber lead ball tearing into your leg, tearing into your uniform, is not only dragging the skin and the bone and the muscle through, it's also dragging those months of dirt and grime and debris. By the way, anytime you hear somebody talk about how dirty the internal combustion engine is, ask them if they really want to go back to the days of the horse and buggy. Believe it or not, the internal combustion engine was actually sold to the American public for transportation of horses. And if you don't believe me, just take a look at pictures from the late 19th century, the sanitary quarters or the sanitary services in most cities. They wore white uniforms. They weren't picking up trash. They were picking up horse manure in the streets. Horse manure obviously attracts flies. Flies carry vectors. It's a very ugly sight. Exactly. Convalescent hospitals got you there, usually by train, gave you a loud opportunity to recuperate. Most soldiers in the South recuperated at home. And I'm going to explain why that was actually a better deal than going to a hospital. Both strategically for the Confederacy and for the morale of the soldier and the family. Death rates were high, as most of you probably are aware. I don't need to postulate on this any longer. Disease killed most soldiers. Diarrhea, obviously, being the worst. Fevers, eruptive diseases. You can put anything on that. That's kind of a catch-all for everything else. Other primary killers, and you can see the death rates down there. 15% of federal soldiers. So think about that number. 15% of 100. That 15 soldiers are going to die simply for diseases. And that's not even talking about battlefield injuries. 12% of Confederate soldiers. There's a very famous painting, if you go up to, there's a very famous painting that was done during the war of the camp life down in Mississippi. It's very idealistic, beautiful, everything's green, soldiers are living in clean tents. They're all reasonably well dressed for the period early in the war. It looks clean, it looks antiseptic. That is not the reality of camp life. Now, this is not to say that there was an ignorance among our soldiers and our officers of how to maintain sanitary conditions. During the American Revolutionary War, some debate whether or not he was a real baron or not, a gentleman named Baron von Steuben, who got recruited by Benjamin Franklin to come over as a Prussian military officer. He actually wrote something called the Blue Book. For those of you who served in the military, particularly in the Army, many installations actually have a Blue Book. It's the standard of soldiers. And in the Blue Book that von Steuben wrote, he talks about how to maintain sanitary conditions. Number one, your drinking water is upstream, your latrine is downstream. X number of soldiers' tents should be split between distances. Now, this was more based on those concepts of where malaria came, which during this period was not thought of as coming from a vector from mosquito, but now air. That's what malaria means. So how do you solve that problem? Keep people spread out. Anybody ever see the classic Warner Brothers film Jezebel? Video game, it's a great film, by the way. I highly recommend you watch it. It's sort of a black and white film.
Forgot to warn you about that.
Yeah. It's a black and white version of what essentially is Gone with the Wind. Betty Davis is famous, and so is Henry Fonda. It takes place in the antebellum city of about 1856 in New Orleans. They have a yellow fever outbreak. But when the outbreak happens, they're standing on the plantation house, and they hear the cannon fire. This is 1856. They hear cannon fire in the background. Henry Fonda's wife, Bo, or his wife's name is Bo, but his wife goes, "What's the cannon fire?" He said, "We're using it to blow the bad air out of the city." Now we laugh at that today, but we just went through an entire pandemic where people were forced to wear masks that may or may not have had an intrinsic value. So before you laugh at 1856 medical theories, I'm going to argue Dr. Fauci might in fact maybe just as guilty of some sins, but that's my personal opinion, not that of the Air Force or any government agency. By the way, I don't begrudge anybody who wears a mask. Please, if you feel you need to, do so. If you choose not to, I fully support that too. However, blowing cannons around in the city will not solve your yellow fever problem. Yes. So, how do we get around how do we get around this? So, treatments and recovery. Well, obviously the Yankees are blockading the Confederacy. Effectively, I might add, for the most part, with some exceptions, Wilmington, Mobile, obviously. Confederates actually come up with a rather interesting way of dealing with this problem. Surgeon Major Francis Crocher is given a directive by the Confederate War Department to come up with a methodology of getting around this problem and getting medicine. By the way, quinine doesn't exist. It's sort of anesthesia. So the scene you see where there's nothing to build a before we amputate. That's not entirely true. There was anesthesia. Not just loud. Not just a lot of whisper. Francis Portrait comes up with this idea. Why don't we use the treatment Now, the vinegar obviously serves as an antiseptic. The oil serves as a lubricant and helps rejuvenate the skin. But it is the paper itself, the leaching of the materials. And by the way, that wasn't an idea that the Confederacy came up with. Anybody here in the Napoleonic history? If you're not, I highly recommend you read a series of books called Sharpe's Rifles. It's about the 95th Rifles Regiment during the Peninsula Campaign in the Napoleonic Wars. One of the soldiers talks about using paraffin and good brown paper to heal wounds, to take care of joint injuries. Yes, it was. A very good one, by the way. Very good one. White pine and ginseng. We got plenty of white pine around here. Stored in Jordan. There's plenty of it. Ginseng. Sore lips, and by the way, it's administered as tea. If you've ever had white pine tea, it's actually pretty good. The poultice. One of my favorite topics. So many of you have seen, some of you are thinking the movie Josie Wells. They're at the ferry crossing. Your grandmother comes out. She hands him a cheesecloth with poultice. Granny Hawkins. What does she have in the poultice? Mustard leaves and what else? Moss. Moss. Yes, moss is an antiseptic. Watch the movie The Horse Soldier. By the way, I refer to a lot of William Holt and John Wayne. Good film, yes, they're both Yankees, but okay. The doctor, William Holden, plays a soldier, a Yankee cavalry soldier, is wounded in the leg. He says, keep this moss poultice on there. And he does it. And where we see moss again become popular? It's during the Second World War. This is how we discovered penicillin. The molds. Now, Basilican, if you don't know what that is, I'm going to tell you, it's herbs, it's bacon fat. What's that? Good stuff. You keep it on the wound. It covers the wound, the herbs, the moss, all over. You put that on there, keep it wrapped up, keeps the infection. I'm not saying it's a perfect system, by the way, not always. Something like Basilican. What's that?
Why did Grace what we used to put on horse?
Yes, oh, thank you, yes. By the way, yes, don't underestimate the value of a good horse doctor. Laudanum and chloroform. Laudanum, of course, laudanum, obviously. Opium. We didn't quite actually, that's not true. We did understand the addictive nature. Self-medicating got it in trouble. And of course, chloroform, which existed. The Confederacy had it too. In fact, Margaret Mitchell actually refers to that in the book On with the Wind, and you see it in the movie when they're at the Atlanta train station. Dr. Meade is having to do amputations, and he says, don't have any chloroform. It's the pain. Amputations within 48 hours, usually, if you had an amputation. Doctors got very good at it. There was a very good scientific process of how to get after an amputation to reduce the infection. By the way, most broken bones were not going to be repaired. Once a bone is shattered in this era, there's not like you're going to steel bar in the leg. That injury is pretty permanent. My grandmother, God rest her soul. So by the way, my wife is Altieri. I'm a second generation Native American. My grandfather came over, my other grandfather came over from Italy. His wife came from Italy. She had a bone removed from her arm because of cancer. And you can imagine the right arm, so she could not use that arm for the sparing. And you can imagine what a shattered bone would do to a soldier. They essentially crippled. So in many ways, amputation would do you a favor.
So you mentioned the doctors protective techniques in amputation.
Oh, so they actually, so the saws, the blades, many doctors can do an amputation within a minute. Now I want you to think about that. I put the strap on, cut the circulation off, I cut the skin around. I hope I'm not being too graphic for the younger ones, but essentially I'm cutting the skin away. I can do this within a minute to 2 minutes, and then take that saw and saw through there quickly. Because the faster I took care of it, the less likely to shock to the system.
So technical speed.
Yes, and the equipment. There were actually knives, blades, and saws that were designed for this. Specifically. Now, many of them look like butcher's knives. Butchers were very good at this.
So these treatments carried.
They're carried by the doctors. The doctors would have a kit, the Duke factory.
All these things.
Yes. Well, many of them. A lot of these were home remedies as well. I'm going to talk about a little more on that in a second.
Some of those instruments are on display at the Museum of Alice Springs.
Yes, yeah, you'll see a lot of them out there. They're actually quite elegant, very well made, very expensive. By the way. Not just expensive as historical artifacts today, but they were expensive even in those days. And this last one, post-traumatic stress, it existed. It was known then as apoplexy at the beginning of the war. By the end of the war, it becomes known as soldier's heart. The theory was that these ailments, these mental ailments, these emotional ailments came from the heart itself. Hence the term soldier's heart. Treatments, in this case, cutting, bleeding. Again, heart related, so let's take some of the blood out. Alcohol, particularly post-war, becomes a way to self-medicate. Opium becomes a way to self-medicate. The second order effects to this are, number one, there is an increase in saloons and taverns in the United States. So much so that alcoholism becomes such a major problem that a certain lady named Carrie, whose last name I shall not mention, took an axe and would go in and destroy it. This will give you the 18th Amendment, one of the worst amendments ever put together
Amen.
by anybody. There's also, so that's on one end of the spectrum. The other end of the spectrum is there's a revival in religion. God is punishing me. I must atone for my sins, whatever those sins may be. So you see this religious fervor that grows in the 19th century. It also becomes part of a mature certain moral values. By the way, this is not what we're experiencing today. It existed in the late 19th century. Those godless Yankees who live in cities don't share the same values as those of us who live in the rural communities. So a return to religion does exist. But we gotta get the soldiers, we gotta get the wounded, we gotta get the injured to the hospital. This is where we get the ambulance. Baron Larrey actually creates something called the Flying Ambulance Corps, or the Ambulance Volante, with a dedicated staff and drivers to get wounded soldiers off the Napoleonic battlefield. Napoleon, brilliant strategist, cared for his soldiers. He makes these famous comments about an army marches on its stomach, because Napoleon understood if I can't get my soldiers food and healthy food, they're not going to fight in combat. He also understood the value of getting them off the battlefield and getting the medal, because historically, every time you go, by the way, working wounded soldier is one of the largest combat distractors. Now, of course, during the American Civil War, both sides had studied Napoleon, had studied Germany. Nobody here was wearing a gray. Thank you. Very French design. We adopt that technique, but we don't adopt it immediately. Although there were ambulances in the antebellum army, it's not until the battle of Manassas Junction and Malvern Hill outside of Richmond that we realized, both sides, both the Confederacy and the Federal Army, realized they needed ambulances. Things did not go well for the wounded after the battle of Manassas Junction. And Malvern Hill, which should have been a precursor, which I would submit to you was a precursor to the Battle of Gettysburg, operationally and tactically, huge casualties. Malvern Hill, if you've never been to that area of Richmond, is about 18 miles from downtown Richmond. Our boys in gray, many of them, and some in blue, actually had to crawl and walk to get to the general hospitals in downtown Richmond. It was so bad that the wounded soldiers crawling, walking, and bleeding out in the streets, the good citizens of the city of Richmond came out and opened their homes up to them. Brought food, brought what medicines they have, took care of them, fed them. Jefferson Davis, the Secretary of War, saw this and said, this cannot happen again. We have to do something about this. So the Federals actually get to it first. They create a Federal Ambulance Corps, and in typical congressional fashion, they create a congressional mandate without any funding. Boy, there's no surprise there. Create a law and said it's your problem. The Army said, time out, Secretary of War staff said, if you want this, you're gonna pay for it. Eventually they did. Confederate government followed the same thing. We use the federal model, it worked. It's a good idea, don't steal it. Just go ahead and steal it. Create a medical department with officers. But now we've got to distinguish the non-combatants from the combatants. This is where you get the red armbands or hat bands that say Ambulance Corps across the top. Sometimes it's something as simple as just writing a piece of paper across your hat. This is Ambulance Corps. And it was understood by both sides, these are non-combatants, these are not shooters. Organized one captain per corps, one lieutenant per division. Sergeants and privates were driving wagons. One of the biggest challenges we had for officers, out of 8 officers, and I was one, officers tended to think that the ambulance wagons were carrying their bag and baggage on and off the battlefield. Confederate government, the Confederate Army actually had to issue an edict to all officers, ambulances were not for your personal transportation. Stop. Ambulances generally came in 2 types, 2-wheeled and 4-wheeled. The federal types, by the way, the Confederacy copied these 2, or grabbed them when they took over the arsenals and federal facilities. The Finley type, which had 2 wheels, obviously less maintenance. However, the ride was miserable. The Coolidge, Howard, and Rutgers all had 4-wheel. Most of them had some type of springs or Indian rubber. We did understand the value of not having people bouncing around. It was a start. Better than being very often a litter. Some final thoughts on this. By 1863, we are now reducing the number of deaths on the battlefield significantly. I'm not saying it goes away completely. Here's the problem. While we are reducing the number of deaths due to injuries, the number of deaths actually are still going up because the tactics are changing. Grant has basically told Lincoln, I'm going to defeat the Confederates right, so Sherman, although to a lesser extent. Both sides recognize the combat multiplier effect. Hey, if I'm wounded, who's going to come get me? Shock is what kills most people in combat. Even small wounds. Knowing that somebody is going to come get me, knowing that I may have a chance to live, and I see my family again, that's a combat multiplier. Formalized within the U.S. Army, we actually did something called the Sanitary Commission because the hospitals are appallingly bad. So a commission is set up to make sure that we have cleaner hospitals. The Confederacy tries that as well. Afforded doctors and ambulance drivers battlefield protection. So the leader codes, if you're not familiar with these are essentially the first laws of war to protect non-combatants, civilians, doctors. Now, let's not kid ourselves, these were not all, the niceties of war were not always followed. And I'm going to be honest here, I need to stop. But we're trying. We're trying to codify something. This will be important also for prisoners of war when you talk about exchanges, when you talk about parole. Of course, the famous one is the one I like at the Battle of Vicksburg when an entire Alabama regiment is paroled and said, go home. How do they fix that problem? When they come home, they immediately read the flags, another unit go right back into combat. Allow some invalid soldiers to still serve in non-combatant roles. So we have these things called invalid corps. The Federals have a huge one. They actually have a distinctive gray uniform. Why they picked that? I know why they picked that color. That was the pre-war uniform. Why I bring this gentleman up in particular, Sergeant Joseph W. Wheelis. I was talking to you about this earlier. Sergeant Wheelis is an interesting story. He's 36 years old when the war starts. He's a college professor at Wake Forest College. His family owns land in Central North Carolina. He enlists along with his brother, along with his studies. Nothing new there. Joins what originally was the 5th North Carolina Regiment, then gets reflagged as the 15th North Carolina, and eventually becomes the 32nd North Carolina. Joseph is a soldier infantry. The Battle of Malvern Hill, he gets a bullet wound to his right patella. That's around the kneecap. And of course, he drags himself, at least from what we believe, all the way to General Hospital number 2 in Richmond. He survives. He is then sent home. I mentioned the convalescing at home. He gets on a train, goes back to Halifax County, North Carolina, and that's where he spends the next 6 months with his family recovering. After he recovers, obviously walking is a little more difficult. But he's raised on a farm. He's been a teamster before, as well as a college professor. He now becomes an ambulance driver. So now he's freeing up another soldier to serve on the line. By the way, don't think he doesn't get off easily too. He's going to wind up in action. Spotsylvania Courthouse. Some references if you want to read more about this. Schroeder Langdon talks about the Encyclopedia of Civil War Medicine. It's actually a pretty good read. It goes a lot deeper with some of these topics. Robert Denny talks about Civil War medicine, care and comfort for the wounded. And then there's this last book I highly recommend, and I want to thank the docents at the Civil War Museum at the old courthouse in Vicksburg. They were the ones that turned me on to this. Oh, if you haven't been to Vicksburg, go see it. It's beautiful. Every man his own physician, being a complete collection of efficacious and approved remedies for every disease incident to the human body, with plain instructions for the common use, edition number 2. Now you'll notice that publication date is 1764. This is published in London. What I discovered in my research was that a lot of colonial families brought this book with them. They came over from the home country, and they handed this book down through generations. And even during the American Civil War, this book would be found in many homes, many families. Based on my research, used books like this and others for those home remedies to take care of the loved ones. And this book covers it all. Everything from pregnancies to what they refer to as breeding wounds. You don't know what a breeding wound is. It's when a wound becomes infected and then the breeding pus comes out. It's better than nothing. Quite frankly, it probably did save lives. This is up in Mary's Height, Battle of Fredericksburg. Sergeant Richard Kirtland, 2nd South Carolina. You know the story, of course, the 69th New York Regiment attacks Mary's Heights. It ends that. The Confederates are entrenched in what's called the Sunken Road. You see the movie Gods, but they don't actually show this. It's more poignant when you see it in reality. The Confederates are in defilade, up to their necks, and they're firing over the walls as volley, and they are killing soldiers by the dozen. By the way, there was also an Irish unit on the Confederate side as well, which is a rather poignant moment, knowing that there might have been cousins from Tipperary killing another cousin from Tipperary. After the end of the battle, the Yankee soldiers are laying there wounded, and nobody's coming to get them, and Sergeant Kirkland goes out there and gives water and meat to many of the Yankee soldiers. Unfortunately, this day and age, ladies and gentlemen, I don't know how much longer that statue's going to stay there. But there it is. So now I get I'll get to flog this for 1 second. So, why Joseph W. White Wheelis, 32nd North Carolina? Told you he enlisted at the age of 36 as a college professor, wounded in Malvern Hill. He comes back after 6 months, returns to the 32nd North Carolina, now as an ambulance driver. His next stop was a little crossroads in Pennsylvania called Gettysburg. And if you know the story of Gettysburg, what happens on July 3rd is only half the story. It is the retreat getting back across the Potomac River, which is an even bigger story that most people don't know about. But Lee gets his entire army back across that river before the Yankees can capture him. Wheelis is driving an ambulance. When he gets back, his next stop is a place called the Battle of the Wilderness. He survives this. And then Spotsylvania Courthouse, he is going to be captured. He is going to spend 6 months as a prisoner at a place called Point Lookout in Maryland. He is going to be paroled. I'm sorry, hold on. He's going to be exchanged. Taken down to City Point, walks back to Richmond, gets on the train. Next stop, the siege of Petersburg. His regiment is one of the 3 regiments that assaults Fort Stedman. If you've never read that story, that was the last offensive action of the Army of Northern Virginia on the Eastern Front. He survives that. His next stop is the retreat from Richmond out of Petersburg to a place called the Battle of Sailor's Creek. His ambulance is nearly captured there, but they escape. Last stop is a little courthouse in Central Virginia called Appomattox. 32nd North Carolina was actually the last Confederate unit engaged in combat. He will go back. He will pick up his former trade as a college professor part-time. He will start a farm. He will get married to Zenobia, his wife, very well-educated woman. You will see some of her writings in this book. And 4 generations later, his great-great-great-granddaughter will become my wife. So this is not only a labor of love because I'm a historian, but the family asked me to write this book. iUniverse Publishing, 230 pages. I hope to have it out by the end of the year. The editor and I are having a bit of a knife fight right now about the cover. Nothing serious, usual editorial challenges, but I'll make sure I send a message out when the book is ready for publication and for sale. It'll probably go about $25. I hope you read it. Thank you very much for your time.
On the brown paper, I'm sure there are different types of tree bark that do different things. I know aspirin comes from that. Would that be?
Yes.
When they're talking about that brown paper, are they talking aspirin or quinine or what are they?
It could be either one. I mean, if the papers, most of the paper you're thinking about is the one for aspirin,
Yeah.
but quinine also, that bark as well. Unfortunately, I was a criminal justice major, not a science major in college, so if you ask me for the name, I'll have to go look it up again. But yeah, but we understood the value of tree bark as a healing agent.
Right.
Christopher Columbus gets here, the other Spanish explorers, and they're seeing the natives are using it. They're chewing on it. They're grinding it up and putting it on wounds. I mean, when we come to the New World, we're seeing the Native Americans here using this. We're not stupid. It's like, hey, I got a wound here. I would have died. So yes, all those medicinal properties from different barks. Is anybody here has a tree bark? My daughter's actually, by the way, she's actually going to be a fortune report major in Georgia. She can tell me all about this, and it's quite fascinating.
I have a mini orchard at my house in Connecticut.
Oh.
Well, I recommend this TV series to my students. I'm a chemistry professor at the Marx London Institute,
Nice.
otherwise known as City University of New York.
Yes.
And I recommend a series called Guns, Germs, and Steel.
Yes, great book on that. Yes, very good book. If you haven't read it, it talks about how geography, how cultures actually influence how nations rise and fall, and how some societies are more successful based on the geography, based on clients, based on their societal norms. It's a good, I can't remember the author's name now.
I don't remember either.
I think it's Samuel Huntington. Yes, sir.
If there was a Confederate doctor that helped the Union, was there a Union doctor that helped?
Oh yes, and I'm glad, son. That is, what's your name? Robert, that's a great question. So that's actually a great point to bring up. I talk about the fever codes here. It's not unusual at the end of battle. Commanders would go out and say, all right, we've got enough finish today, let's take care of it. And remember, this is a war of cousins, this is a war of brothers. Doctors would treat on, in fact, I mentioned the Battle of Fort Stedman during the Petersburg campaign. Sergeant Wheelis actually took Confederate wounded over to the federal hospitals on the Yankee side for them to get treatment. Now, understanding once they go there, they're going to be captured. But this is actually a pretty good move on the part of the Confederates, but it does reach up their resources. But on the flip side of the coin, federal soldiers who were wounded were taken to the Confederate hospital. They were just left behind for the Yankees to roll up with. back.
When you say Confederate hospital, is that a field hospital?
That's a field hospital.
And I'm thinking shot.
Yeah, okay, yes, so please add more to that, please, yes.
Well, I don't know if they're at, but I've always wondered, so many people injured, killed, would they set these field hospitals up before the battle started?
Sometimes, like at Gettysburg, yes, they did. And the hospitals could be everything from an old train depot, if it's nearby, which is convenient, because I can put them on the train, to a barn. Sometimes it's just a couple of tents set out in the middle of the field under wood. Shiloh's an interesting case study you bring up. So, during the Battle of Shiloh, of course, if you know the battles, anybody who's not been to the Battle of Shiloh, the battlefield is kind of remote. You have to really go out of your way to want to get there, but it's actually quite beautiful. So it sits in this marshy ground. After the Battle of Shiloh, the second night, and both nights, soldiers' diaries talk about this glow that is hanging over many of the wounded soldiers. And there's a couple of names for it, the Angels of Shiloh. And most historians and most medical doctors said, yeah, whatever, it was combat, it was shock, PTSD of the battle. They're just imagining things. Turned out they weren't imagining things. 2004, of all things, a young man, probably a little older than Robert over here, read this in a book and talked to his mom, who happened to be a microbiologist. And Mom said, that's interesting. Because there is a bacteria in this part of southern Tennessee, northern Mississippi, and northern Alabama, that when it gets into dead skin, that bacteria actually produces a larvae or a worm that has a phosphorescent glow to it.
Bioluminescence.
Yes, thank you. And guess what that worm does? It eats dead flesh. So what's happening is these souls, by the way, I want you to think about this. The ones who are writing about this angel's glow at the Battle of Shiloh were the wounded soldiers who survived. And what the research discovered was the soldiers that had that glow around them, this bioluminescence from these worms, they lived because it killed all the bacteria that was going to infect the wounds. And we didn't discover this until about 2004.
Similar to what maggots do.
Yes, very similar to what maggots. By the way, maggots are listed in Dr. Theobald's book. Maggots are not to be underrated. Yes, it sounds grim, but it's actually doing somebody a favor. That's a great question. I'm glad somebody brought that up. I'm sorry?
It was Robert.
Oh, it was Robert. Robert, thank you. Yes, sir.
Are you taking republication orders?
I can. If you would, in fact, if you send me an email at a, by the way, so the title is yes, Mr. Lincoln. By the way, that phrase has never really been used before until now, but that was the best title I could come up with for somebody who was a guest of Mr. Lincoln's prisoner of war. So if you'll simply write a guest of Mr. Lincoln at gmail.com, I will take a pre-order. Can't guarantee you exactly when it's going to come out, but I plan on having it out this year.
Where'd the title come from again?
I just thought of it because when I went up there, I thought, Joseph got to be a guest of the President of the United States for 6 months, so that's where I came up with the title. Yeah, so that, yes, by the way, the publisher, the editor loved that title, thought that was kind of confusing. So yes, a guest of Mr. Lincoln. The book is based on, the book follows, I don't want to give the whole thing away, the book is based on this idea. So I'm a military historian, and I'm writing this for my family, for my wife's family. They really don't understand the bigger picture of the Civil War. So you're going to see the themes of the book generally go from what's going on in the world, and particularly in the United States and the Confederate States in the American period, and then it draws it down to the individual soldier life. So that, and again, so if you are a historian of this period, you'll probably say, yeah, I really do this. The audience I'm tailoring this for is the generations who don't understand the which I personally think is important. As a Anybody here a Vietnam veteran? Anybody know a Vietnam veteran?
They're not here, yeah.
Okay, so why I bring this up, the Vietnam War frustrates me. There's a lot of legend, there are a lot of myths, there's a lot of misconceptions. Not just about the soldiers on the ground. Platoon's a fun movie to watch, but Platoon has a lot of problems, historically. The idea that the Vietnam veteran was messed up when he came home, that's not entirely true. Read Burkett's book, Stolen Valor. He's a Vietnam veteran himself. It frustrates him to no end that Hollywood's image of the Rambos of the world is not true. A couple of months ago, last year, I was doing a friend of mine was owned a what's called an O2 Skymaster airplane. Where I'm going with this is relating back to the book. He said, hey, you ought to check this website out about these pilots that flew these airplanes over to Vietnam. The website is written by an Air Force colonel now who's passed away, but it was full of inaccuracies. Of course, if it's on the internet, it must be true. And I knew they were wrong, but this website I found had been cited over and over by reasonably competent historians, and I said, I know this isn't true. So I went in last year and I wrote a book about the real story of these pilots. Not because I know any of them personally, but their memory, what they did, deserves to be told historically accurately, and not, as you all are familiar with a lot of revision. And sometimes the truth hurts, and sometimes the truth has to hurt to tell the true story. I think I'm out of time.
Anything
now.
else?
Yes, please.
We got all the time there willing to
Oh,
talk.
okay, yeah.
You're the one that's got to fly tonight.
I'll keep talking. Well, I got coffee now.
Good to go.
Well, thank you so much then. I appreciate your time this evening.